Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time we're going deep on a topic that I think is super relevant to a lot of our listeners. Healthy eating, but specifically for kids between 1 and 10 years old.
Oh yeah, big topic. Lots to unpack there for sure.
Definitely. And to do that, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a podcast called Kids Health Hub. It's got some really interesting insights, so I'm excited to dig in and see what we can uncover. And I think our listeners, whether they're parents or maybe thinking about becoming parents someday, or even if they just, find this stuff fascinating like I do, there's going to be something here for everyone.
Totally. I think what's really cool about this topic is that even if you don't have kids, a lot of the principles we're talking about apply to everyone. It's all about nutrition and how it impacts us, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally too.
Absolutely. So right off the bat, the podcast highlighted 3 major benefits of a healthy diet for kids. Physical growth, which I think is pretty obvious, but then also boosting brain power and then creating those lifelong healthy habits. Now that brain power bit, that really caught my attention. What's the connection there?
Well, you know how important nutrition is for our brains as adults, right? Well, for kids, it's even more crucial. Their brains are developing so rapidly, and those specific nutrients act like fuel. For example, omega-3 fatty acids, which you find in things like fatty fish or walnuts, are crucial for memory and focus in kids.
So like those brain boosting supplements, they market to adults, but it's actually way more important for kids.
Exactly. And then you've got B vitamins, which are abundant in leafy greens and whole grains, and those play a key role in mood regulation and maintaining steady energy levels. We all know what it feels like to have that brain fog, right?
Oh yeah, 100%. So you're saying if we feed our kids salmon salads and spinach smoothies, they'll be like little geniuses?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but you get the idea. The right nutrition can definitely make a difference in their cognitive function and overall well-being.
Okay, I'm sold. Sign me up for the salmon salad. But in all seriousness, it can be super overwhelming, There's so much conflicting information out there about nutrition. What does a balanced diet actually look like in practice? Like, what are the essentials?
Yeah, no, for sure. It's easy to get lost in all the noise. The podcast breaks down into 5 core components, which makes it a lot easier to grasp. So we've got fruits and vegetables.
Okay, the classics. Can't go wrong there.
Exactly. Then whole grains, proteins, healthy fats.
Hold on, healthy fats? I thought we were supposed to avoid fat.
That's a common misconception. There are actually good fats and bad fats. Healthy fats, like those found in avocados, nuts, and olive oil, are essential for brain development, especially in growing kids. They've gotten a bad rap in the past, but we're starting to understand just how important they are.
Okay, that's good to know. My avocado toast habit is officially justified.
As long as it's whole grain toast.
Touché. So we've got our fruits and veggies, whole grains, protein, and healthy fats. What was that last one?
Oh, the most important one of all, water.
Of course, how could I forget? Water is life. But even knowing all this, it can still be a struggle to actually get kids to eat healthy, right? And especially with picky eaters and, the ever-present allure of junk food.
Yeah, that's where the real challenge comes in.
Yeah.
But the podcast had some really practical tips on that front. One thing they emphasized was involving kids in the kitchen as much as possible.
I love that idea. Turn meal prep into a family affair.
Exactly. Even young kids can help wash vegetables, stir ingredients, or even choose what goes in a meal.
Giving them a sense of ownership, right? Makes them more invested in what they're eating.
Precisely. And it can make mealtimes more fun and less of a battle, which, let's be honest, is a win for everyone.
100%. It's a win-win. So involving kids in the kitchen, what else did the podcast recommend?
Well, one tip I thought was really smart, especially for the younger ones, is all about presentation. Cut those fruits and veggies into fun shapes, like star-shaped cucumber slices or heart-shaped watermelon chunks.
Genius. I can totally see that working. Turn healthy food into edible art.
Exactly. Make it visually appealing, and suddenly broccoli becomes a lot more interesting.
Okay, that's going on my Pinterest board for sure. What about whole grains? I know they're good for us, but how do we make them appealing to kids? They can be kind of, bland.
The podcast used this great analogy that really stuck with me. They said to think of whole grains like those slow-burning logs in a fireplace. They release energy gradually throughout the day, keeping kids feeling full and energized for longer.
Okay, I like that analogy. So it's sustained energy, not that quick burst and then crash that you get from refined grains.
Right. Refined grains are like kindling. A quick burst of energy followed by a slump.
So whole wheat bread over white bread, brown rice over white rice.
Got it. Exactly. And it can really make a difference in a child's focus and mood throughout the day. No more afternoon meltdowns from those sugar crashes.
That alone is worth its weight in gold. Speaking of things that are worth their weight in gold, let's talk about healthy fats. We've already touched on this a bit, but why are they so important for growing kids, particularly for brain development?
Well, think of healthy fats as the building blocks for brain cells. They help with the formation of cell membranes, which are crucial for communication between those brain cells. And they also play a role in protecting the brain from damage. The podcast specifically mentioned avocados, nuts, and olive oil as excellent sources of these brain-boosting fats.
Got it. So we've got our brain-boosting foods down. Fruits and veggies, whole grains, protein, healthy fats, and of course, plenty of water. But I'm curious, what did the podcast have to say about navigating those picky eaters? I mean, every parent I know faces that battle at some point.
Oh, for sure. It's a universal struggle. One of the things they suggested was offering new foods alongside familiar favorites. Don't pressure them to eat everything, just encourage a small bite or two. And remember, patience is key. It can take multiple exposures for a child to accept a new food.
That's a good point. It's easy to get discouraged, but consistency is key. What about those inevitable junk food cravings, though? How do we navigate those in a healthy way?
The podcast really emphasized balance and moderation. Instead of banning treats entirely, which can actually backfire and make them more desirable, allow them in moderation. Maybe a small treat once or twice a week or a small portion alongside a healthier option.
It's like the 80-20 rule, right? Make healthy choices most of the time and then allow for some flexibility without the guilt.
Exactly. And I love that they actually included perspectives from kids themselves in this podcast. It wasn't just adults talking at kids about healthy eating.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. What did the kids have to say? What were some of their favorite healthy foods?
It was so refreshing to hear their take on it. Their favorite healthy foods were surprisingly simple, actually. Carrots for their crunch and sweetness, apples with peanut butter, and bananas for a quick energy boost on the go.
Oh, that's so cute. It really highlights how enjoyable healthy food can be for kids, even without any fancy preparations.
Absolutely. Sometimes the simplest foods are the most satisfying. And speaking of challenges, let's dive into some of the specific hurdles that parents mentioned in the podcast and the solutions that were offered. Picky eating, as we've discussed, was a big one. But they also talked about those times when healthy choices are limited, like at birthday parties or holiday gatherings. How do we navigate those situations without turning into the food police?
Yeah, that's a tough one. What did they suggest?
Well, for picky eating, they really emphasize creating a positive and pressure-free environment around food. It's about making meal times enjoyable, not a battleground. They also suggested offering new foods alongside those familiar favorites, encouraging small bites without forcing consumption.
Makes sense. It's about creating a positive association with food, not making it a stressful experience.
Right. And for those situations where healthy choices are limited, they recommended having open conversations with kids beforehand about making healthy choices while still allowing some flexibility to enjoy those special occasions. Finding that balance between guidance and freedom.
So it's about teaching them to make informed choices, even when those less healthy options are available.
Exactly. And of course, the most powerful tool we have is modeling those healthy habits ourselves. Kids are incredibly observant, and they're more likely to adopt healthy habits if they see us doing the same.
That's so true. We can't expect them to eat their broccoli if we're reaching for the potato chips, right?
Exactly. Actions speak louder than words, especially when it comes to food.
But what about the cost factor? Healthy food can be expensive. Did the podcast address that?
They did, and they offered some great tips for making healthy eating more affordable, like planning meals around seasonal produce, buy in bulk whenever possible, and prioritizing home-cooked meals over takeout or convenience foods.
Those are all great strategies. It's a good reminder that healthy eating doesn't have to break the bank. And I love that they emphasize the importance of involving kids in the kitchen. Can you give us some specific examples of how to do that?
Sure. You can start with simple tasks like washing fruits and veggies or helping measure ingredients. As they get older, they can help with meal planning, chopping veggies, or even trying out simple recipes. The key is to make it fun and engaging. Put on some music, let them get a little messy, and turn it into a fun family activity rather than a chore.
I love that idea. Creating those positive memories in the kitchen is so important. And it reminds me of how simple the kids' favorite healthy foods were in the podcast. Carrots, apples, bananas, nothing fancy or complicated. It's a good reminder that healthy eating doesn't have to be about gourmet recipes or expensive ingredients.
Exactly. Often the simplest foods are the most nutritious and the most appealing to kids. It's about focusing on those whole unprocessed foods and letting their natural flavors shine through.
It's about stripping away the complexity and getting back to the basics. And one basic element that we often overlook, especially when we're talking about kids, is hydration. What did the podcast have to say about the importance of water?
Oh, they emphasized that water should be the primary source of hydration for kids, and they advised limiting sugary drinks, which can contribute to all sorts of problems like cavities, weight gain, and even mood swings.
So water is the way to go, good old H2O. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to healthy eating, especially when it comes to kids. Every child is unique. What did the podcast suggest in terms of personalizing the approach?
They encouraged parents to pay attention to their children's cues, be flexible, and adapt their strategies based on their individual needs and preferences. Some kids might need smaller, more frequent meals, while others might thrive on a more structured eating schedule. It's about finding what works best for your family and not getting caught up in rigid rules or comparisons.
It's about honoring each child's individuality and creating a supportive and nurturing environment around food. And something that struck me as we were preparing for this deep dive was how much the conversation around healthy eating has evolved over the years. We've moved away from those rigid diet rules and restrictive approaches to a more holistic and intuitive understanding of nutrition. It's less about deprivation and more about nourishment for both the body and the mind.
It's true. We've come a long way. And I think that's a really positive shift. It's about recognizing that food is more than just fuel. It's a source of pleasure, connection, and well-being. And it's about empowering kids to develop a positive and healthy relationship with food that will serve them throughout their lives.
That's a beautiful way to put it. But before we get too carried away with the philosophy of food, let's address the elephant in the room, sugar. How do we manage those sugar cravings in a way that's healthy and realistic?
Well, the podcast offered some interesting perspectives on this. One suggestion was to focus on the quality of the sugar. Instead of a sugary cereal or candy bar, opt for a piece of fruit, which contains natural sugars along with fiber and other essential nutrients. It's about making those swaps that still satisfy the sweet craving without the nutritional drawbacks.
That makes sense. So it's about choosing treats that provide some nutritional value, not just empty calories.
Right. And if you do find yourself in a situation where you need to grab something quick, try to choose the healthiest option available. Even those small choices can add up over time.
It's about being mindful and making those conscious choices, even when it's not always convenient. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. What's that one question that will stay with them?
This one from the podcast really resonated with me. Think about the messages you received about food as a child, both positive and negative. How did those messages shape your relationship with food? And how might you be passing those messages on to the next generation?
Wow. That is a powerful question. It really makes you stop and think about the influence of our own experiences and the messages, both conscious and unconscious, that we might be passing on. But before we send our listeners down that rabbit hole of introspection, let's take a quick break and come back for part 2 of our deep dive into healthy eating for kids. That question really gets you thinking, about how much those early experiences with food can really shape our relationship with it down the line. Both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. And how we might be unknowingly passing those same messages on to our own kids.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. But I think the important thing is just to be aware of it, to make those conscious choices about the messages we're sending, both through our words and our actions.
Exactly. Yeah. And to create that positive and supportive environment around food for ourselves and for the kids in our lives.
Totally. Speaking of positive experiences, I was really struck by something the podcast talked about, the sensory experience of eating, especially for kids.
Oh, yeah. It's so important. They talked about how kids are often drawn to certain foods because of how they feel in their mouths. The crunch of carrots, the smooth sweetness of applesauce. Those sensory details play a huge role for kids who are still developing their palates.
That's so true. I never thought about it like that, but it makes perfect sense. It's not just about the taste. It's about the whole experience.
Right. It's about engaging all of their senses. And that can make healthy eating more appealing and enjoyable for them.
I love that. So we've talked about the what and the how of healthy eating for kids, but what about the why? Why is it so crucial, especially during those early years?
That's a great question. And the answer goes way beyond just giving them enough to grow. Those first few years are a time of incredibly rapid brain development. And nutrition is a critical factor in that process. We're literally providing the building blocks for their brains.
Wow, that's pretty powerful when you think about it. So it's not just their physical growth we're shaping, but also their mental and emotional well-being.
Precisely. And those benefits extend far beyond childhood. Studies have shown that healthy eating habits in the early years can have a lasting impact on things like academic performance, cognitive function, and even mental health later in life.
That's amazing. It really highlights the importance of those early interventions. But let's be real, life with kids is chaotic. There will be days when those perfectly balanced meals just don't happen. What did the podcast say about managing those less than ideal situations?
They emphasize flexibility, not striving for perfection. It's okay to have those off days. The important thing is that healthy choices are the norm most of the time.
That makes me feel a lot better, to be honest, because let's be real, some days it's all I can do to get a meal on the table, let alone a perfectly balanced one.
Exactly. And involving kids in the process can help with that too. Even young children can participate in meal planning, grocery shopping, or even just setting the table. It gives them a sense of responsibility and ownership over their food choices.
I love that, making them active participants rather than passive recipients. What about those times when healthy choices are limited, though, like at birthday parties or holiday gatherings?
That's a tough one. The podcast suggested having open conversations with kids beforehand, about making healthy choices while still allowing them some flexibility to enjoy those special occasions. It's all about finding that balance.
So it's about guiding them, but not being overly restrictive.
Right. And also modeling those healthy habits ourselves. Kids are always watching. They're more likely to make healthy choices if they see us doing the same.
Lead by example, right. But what about the cost factor? Healthy food can be expensive, especially for families on a budget.
Absolutely. And the podcast addressed that directly. They had several practical tips, like planning meals around seasonal produce, buying in bulk whenever possible, and prioritizing home-cooked meals over takeout or convenience foods.
Those are all great suggestions. It's a good reminder that healthy eating doesn't have to be expensive. And I love that emphasis on involving kids in the kitchen. It's not just about nutrition, it's about creating those positive memories and shared experiences.
Exactly. It's about making healthy eating fun and enjoyable for the whole family. Which brings me back to something we talked about earlier, the kids' favorite healthy foods. You remember how simple they were? Carrots, apples, bananas.
I know, it's so refreshing. It's a reminder that healthy eating doesn't have to be complicated or gourmet. It's about those basic whole foods that nature provides.
And often those are the foods that kids enjoy the most too. It's about stripping away all the complexity and getting back to the basics.
Back to the basics, I like that. And speaking of basics, one that we often overlook, especially with kids, is hydration. Did the podcast talk about the importance of water?
Oh, absolutely. They stress that water should be the primary source of hydration for kids. And they advise limiting sugary drinks as much as possible. Those sugary drinks can contribute to all sorts of problems like cavities, weight gain, and even behavioral issues.
Yeah, the sugar rush and crash is real. So water is the way to go. Good old H2O.
But I think it's important to remember that every child is different. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to healthy eating. What did the podcast have to say about personalizing the approach?
They encouraged parents to be flexible, to pay attention to their children's cues and adapt their strategies based on individual needs and preferences. Some kids might need smaller, more frequent meals, while others might do better with a more structured eating schedule. It's about finding what works best for your family and not getting caught up in rigid rules. It's about honoring each child's individuality and creating a positive and supportive environment around food. As we were preparing for this deep dive, I was struck by how much the conversation around healthy eating has evolved over the years. It's less about those rigid diet rules and restrictions, and more about a holistic and intuitive approach to nutrition. It's less about deprivation and more about nourishment, both for the body and the mind.
I agree. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
And recognizing that food is more than just fuel. It's about pleasure, connection, and well-being. And ultimately, it's about empowering kids to develop a positive and healthy relationship with food that will last a lifetime.
That's beautifully said. But before we get too philosophical, let's address the elephant in the room, sugar. We've talked about balance and moderation, but how do we practically manage those sugar cravings in a way that's healthy and realistic?
Well, the podcast had some interesting thoughts on this. One suggestion was to focus on the quality of the sugar. So instead of a sugary cereal or candy bar, opt for a piece of fruit, which has natural sugars along with fiber and other nutrients. It's about making those swaps that still satisfy the craving, but without the nutritional drawbacks.
That's a great point. It's not about eliminating sugar entirely. It's about making those smart choices.
Exactly. And planning ahead can make a big difference. If you know you're going to be out and about, pack some healthy snacks and drinks. That way you're less likely to give in to those less healthy options when hunger strikes.
It's about being prepared and making those conscious choices, even when it's not always easy. Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder, that one key takeaway that will stay with them.
This question from the podcast really stuck with me. Think about the messages you received about food as a child, both positive and negative. How did those messages shape your relationship with food, and how might you be passing those messages on to the next generation?
Wow, that's a powerful question. It really challenges us to examine our own beliefs and behaviors around food, and to consider the impact we're having on the next generation. But before we send our listeners down that rabbit hole of introspection, let's move on to part 3 and wrap up this fantastic deep dive with a recap of the key takeaways. That question really stays with you, doesn't it? Makes you think about all those things we pick up about food growing up, how it all kind of shapes our view of it, even without us realizing it.
Definitely. And, those early messages don't just influence our preferences. They can actually have a real impact on our health, our well-being, even things like body image. It's all connected.
Really is. But what I like about this whole conversation is that it's not about, beating ourselves up over the past. It's about being more aware, making those conscious choices moving forward, creating a more positive environment around food, both for ourselves and for the kids in our lives.
Exactly. Shifting away from that whole good food versus bad food thing, embracing a more balanced approach.
Right. And remembering that every family is different. There's no magic formula that works for everyone. It's about finding what works for your family, making those gradual changes that you can actually stick with.
Absolutely. And it's never too late to start. Whether you're a parent, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, anyone who interacts with kids, you can make a difference.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired. Ready to put some of these ideas into practice. But before we wrap up our deep dive, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways, just to make sure everyone's got the main points.
That sounds good. So first and foremost, a balanced diet. That means focusing on whole, unprocessed foods. Fruits and veggies, whole grains, lean proteins, healthy fats, the building blocks for those growing bodies and minds.
And let's not forget those 3 major benefits we talked about earlier. Supporting healthy growth, boosting that brain power, and helping kids develop those healthy habits that will last a lifetime. Pretty good reasons to make nutrition a priority, right?
Absolutely. And another big one, getting the kids involved, not just as passive eaters, but as active participants in the whole process. Planning meals, shopping, even cooking together. It makes it more fun for everyone.
And it creates those positive memories around food, which is so important. I love that.
Me too. And lastly, I think it's important to remember that nobody's perfect. We don't have to do everything right all the time. It's about progress, not perfection. Make those gradual changes and give yourselves and your kids grace along the way.
That's a perfect reminder. This has been such a great deep dive, so many valuable insights. A huge thank you to our expert for joining us today and sharing all this amazing information. And of course, a big thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. We hope you learned a few things and maybe got some fresh ideas for how to approach healthy eating with the kids in your lives. Remember, even small changes can make a big difference over time. Until next time, everyone, stay curious and eat well.